What makes you someone who went to an elite university, has had, a great upbringing in life, I would say, quite an international background too, qualified to write this book?
Well, I'm just one of the voices contributing to this debate, and I wanted to bring something that was very practical, a sort of how-to guide to the business community, drawing upon the best of the academic research, but also business case studies, both from our experience at Equality Group, but also ones more broadly in the corporate space. And I think, privilege is something that is wonderful to have. People don't always see the privilege that they have. I think I'm more and more aware of the privilege that I do have, but I see it as an opportunity to open doors for others, and to be able to create opportunities for other people, whether that's the teams that I'm building in business, the candidates we work with, the clients that we serve. I think that's something that can be shared and can be very powerful when it is shared.
What was great about reading some parts of your book, you kind of drew upon your personal experiences, which I think some people will be able to relate to. And there was a bit where you spoke about when you were at Lehman Brothers. I'm not sure what happened to those guys. You were working there, and alongside a woman who was Black, and the both of you were told that you were only there because you were tokens. How did that make you feel, and did that influence you and your other personal life story or life stories influence you writing this book?
Yes, I went to Lehman Brothers straight out of university. I had absolutely nothing to do with the bankruptcy. I was a very lowly analyst in the investment banking division. And my very good friend from university, Lizzie Nyeko, Ugandan woman, both of us separately were told that we would the only reason we'd been hired is because we were women and Lizzie was a Black woman. And I think, and we shared those stories together. But I think I always viewed it as well, fine, I'll take the token card and I'll make the most of it. That for me was an open door to walk through the fact that there were quite a few big finance firms that needed to hire more women into their analyst classes. That gave me a great opportunity and something to build on. But I think that's pervasive today, still, that people feel that they might be hired because they're a token. I would just encourage people to take that opportunity where it's given to them and prove that they're much more than a token.
So this book, it's about not just about taking advantage of those kind of opportunities. It's about actually encouraging the creation of more opportunities and more doors being opened, rather than just like walking through a door if it's open for you. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about creating opportunities for others, but it's also about helping business leaders to see the business opportunities that come through more diverse teams, so that the benefits of greater innovation and productivity and engagement and ultimately sort of bottom line profitability coming through as well.
There was something in the book. It was I think Johnson & Johnson, Microsoft, and DreamWorks. I think they would you say all three of those organizations had something in common specifically with changes that they made?
Yeah, all of those businesses have very tangible case studies that demonstrate the innovation that comes from diverse teams. DreamWorks came about because Melody Hobson, who's a very senior Black finance professional and founder in the US, she was one of the first Black woman to sit on the DreamWorks board. And the story goes that she was at her first board meeting, they were showing a viewing of Megamind, the film Megamind, and Melody commented that she didn't see a single person of color represented in that film. And the founder and CEO of DreamWorks sort of took that quite seriously and promised her after that board meeting that they would never produce a film again without proper racial diversity in the cast. And they went on to produce the film Home, that had Rihanna in the lead. She was the lead voice in the film, and that was one of their highest grossing films, and very much credited to Melody's participation on the board and being able to, think more creatively for that board. And Johnson & Johnson is a story around religious diversity, really, and faith diversity. So a team from Asia went to management and said, look, we don't have any alcohol-free mouthwash, and we think there's a gap in the market, especially in Muslim countries. So we'd like to develop one, and they were given sort of a bit of R&D budget to go and do that. And they developed a mouthwash that was based on green tea. And that ended up being one of the most successful new product launches for Johnson & Johnson in that category. And the final one was Microsoft, under the leadership of Satya Nadella, who's a fantastic leader, and I mentioned him a few times in the book. They've done a lot of work around disability and access to technology, and they've developed an Xbox console. I mean, gaming has become increasingly complex, and there's many, many different things that you can buy around it. But for those that have limited accessibility, it becomes harder to play the games with many, many functional controls. So they created one console that you could use with, say, just one hand, or even just your feet. So you could program it and tailor it in a way that worked for your accessibility needs. So all of those are just different examples of new products, new markets, new audiences that are reached through diversity.
Now, of course, those examples are great, but they're for for quite large companies or corporations globally. If you're a startup, or you're a smaller organization, and you can't see a pathway as to why doing something like this, or chasing diversity, let's just say, can improve the bottom line, what would you say to those kind of companies or founders?
I still think it can absolutely happen from the beginning, just when you're thinking about the values of the organization, what you want to stand for, even the first products that you're designing. I think the benefits of that diverse group of thought and avoiding groupthink come from the very, very beginning. And actually, it's better to do it earlier on. It's easier because it becomes self-perpetuating. It embeds itself into the culture. It becomes easier to hire more diverse talent because people can only be what they can see. So there's quite a few startup examples that I know of, and startups I've worked with, who have absolutely made a concerted effort to build a gender balanced tech team, for example, and made sure that they've gone to the technical schools that have a more balanced pipeline, and made sure they're positioned well to be an attractive employer there. So it's definitely something you can do from day one of a company. And actually, we've done it at a quality group. Year one, I was like, oh no, we're a load of women all here just running this business. We're not as diverse as we need to be. And so made a real concerted effort to go out and find talented men in the industry that would come and join us and be part of the team, and looking for more diversity on our side as we're talking about that with our clients. So I do know firsthand that you'll end up, I just end up hiring bolshy women really in their mid-30s. So I've got to make an effort not to fall victim to affinity bias and go beyond that. So yeah.
So I guess the lessons we can all learn and apply, but I think we can all look back in the last year on there being a pivotal moment, the death of George Floyd over in the United States. And there has been, it seems, an effort by lots of different companies and organizations globally to change the way they do things. I mean, I work in television, and the people I work for have tried to make changes editorially and in terms of recruitment and in terms of how they operate as a company. Have you seen there being a big change in the sectors that you focus on in the last year?
Yes, definitely, in terms of awareness and the topic going up the agenda as a result of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. That really did shift the needle in companies for paying attention to it, and boards thinking, my gosh, we haven't actually really thought about this, beyond maybe what like the women's group are doing. So it was great for bringing the topic of racial equality into the conversation, because I think for too long it's often been stuck on just like white women, and white women that look a lot like the white men in power as well. So it's good for broadening the conversation, and also looking not only at diversity but also inclusion. How do we actually retain and develop this great talent? And so it's been a positive on the awareness side. I'd say there's still a bit a gap in terms of implementation and real activity that drives change in organizations.
So you say there's been like a slowness in terms of implementation. What is it then that these financial or tech companies are so bad at the moment? They need to change more quickly.
And I think they're quite bad at seeing the real business value of diversity and inclusion, and moving it out of just an HR issue into fundamentally a business driver, a place that can really help with the innovations, innovation side, or new markets, revenue generating streams, and seeing it as something that has to be sort of integrated across multiple functions in an organization. I mean, it deeply affects branding, marketing, positioning, product development, as well as HR, people and talent. So getting it much more in the heart of the company and building a really robust strategy around it, having proper incentives so that people are, held to account for what they've committed to do, and really see progress happening.
What you said there about it being at the heart of what the company does, I think is particularly interesting, because at the end of each of your chapters in the book, you have a period, or sorry, not period, you have like a section for reflection. And it seems to me that what you're asking people to do with this playbook, it's not just for the leaders of these companies, it's for everyone to act in some kind of way. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think anyone in an organization can be a change agent and can be empowered with the information and the examples in this book. And definitely there's a number of organizations that have had this change happen from grassroots employees saying, actually, this isn't good enough. You're not doing enough. We want to work for a company that is more inclusive. We want better policies. We want a better culture. And we want to see you as leadership leading by example on this. So I think the change, ultimately, you do need to get the buy-in from the top, but the impetus for change can, and so often does, come from the employees at any level.
So, okay, then let's imagine a scenario where you've got some employees who want change to happen and they're lobbying their bosses to do things a bit differently, but they're not doing that. What should they do? I
think it's important to bring as much of the factual information and data to the management team, but I also think you should go as high as you can possibly go and go to the board, because quite often it's the board that will listen. And they can have a more sort of objective approach. So I think getting as many of the senior stakeholders involved to listen to why this is important, to why it would have value, to understand the research and the data would be worth doing, definitely. But quite often we go into companies and there's a lot of skeptics in the room. Not everyone necessarily wants to be there. They might have been told to be there. And I'd say the way that we go about convincing, which you can't convince everyone, you have to accept that there'll always be 20% that don't want to come along for the ride. But the way that you convince the middle, there's usually about 60% that are swayed by arguments, is good solid data, robust data from your industry, good benchmarking, and then also some personal stories, the stories from your own organization that are really quite eye-opening when people hear them. They go, I had no idea, I just had no idea about that experience of someone here. And I actually quite often say, I can't believe that actually happens here. So it's good, solid data, and then personal stories combined.
So, I mean, I'll give some time to think about some personal stories, maybe, which you can share a bit later on when you've gone into companies. Obviously, I'm going to name the companies because I think people will be quite keen to hear some of those. But one thing I'll ask you though, is how do you move from these principles to actual practical changes?
So the practical changes come about in a few different ways. I've mentioned the strategy before, and I think leadership need to build clear strategy with targets and also build incentives around those targets so that they can be held accountable to them. You then need to have the right infrastructure in place. So that's both the policies that support inclusion and diversity, whether that's shared parental leave, flexible working, things around religious holidays. There's a whole series of policies, and I talk about that in chapter 9. But you also need to look at the people processes in the organization. So the whole way through the talent journey, from hiring and recruitment through to reviews, retention, promotion, succession. And at multiple stages, there's a lot of bias that comes into that. The system most of the time has been designed for a certain type of person, and it needs redesigning for a more diverse population, a more diverse workforce. And in that redesign, then you start to see different results coming through.
So you start seeing the results after that. I mean, what's interesting is obviously the government in the last 6 months, they produced their race and disparities report chaired by Tony Sewell. That review did receive a lot of criticism in the press by by some academics and also by some other community groups. Do you think there was actually anything in the report which could be useful and which companies could apply?
Yes, I think there were a few useful things in it. Overall, I wasn't a big fan of the report. I think it was deeply problematic, especially questioning that there wasn't any structural racism or inequality in our society, which I just think is wrong. And certainly we see differently in organizations. But I think one of the points they did make and they shone a light on was around moving away from the term BAME, Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, and actually looking at individual demographic communities, their specific needs and specific challenges. That I think is helpful. That was good. But it was, yeah, otherwise problematic, I would say.
What do you think about the idea of there being a race pay gap, which is companies report?
I'm all for it. I'm all for reporting on data. I think it's extremely helpful for everyone really to have that data. It gives transparency. It means there's something that can actually be measured and tracked. The gender pay gap reporting that came in was really pivotal actually for driving the gender balance forward in many organizations and giving some baseline data that could be, like I was saying about benchmarking and really understanding where you are in the industry. That's one of the key pieces of information that is needed. So yeah, the race pay gap, race pay reporting would be really good to see in the UK.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there's anything else that you could be learning from other countries at the moment in terms of how we tackle problems of inequality in the workplace in the UK?
Yes, I think the US has actually done a better job on race, ethnicity reporting data. So all companies with over 200 employees have to report on their employee base across gender and race. And they've been doing that for a number of years now. So the quality of the diversity data is better there. And I think we need higher quality data here in Europe. And it is more possible than is often perceived. Because even the EU has allowed for that data to be collected where it is voluntary and completely anonymous and confidentially held. But there's still a lot of fear and a lack of knowledge around that. But without that data, you can't really know where you are at currently as an organization. You can't benchmark yourself and you can't track progress. So it really is an essential part or piece of the puzzle.
You mentioned as well in the book the idea regarding leadership and how it's so important for if culture to change within organizations. Yes, it's very important for individuals to raise their voices and to act in certain ways, but what's really important is for leaders to lead when it comes to changing cultures.
Yeah, I mean, it's essential. I think without the leadership really taking this topic seriously and being vocal and visible on it, things can only sort of change around the edges. And the book is a call to action to leaders to do that, to educate and equip themselves and be bolder about making changes in their organization and wanting to become leaders in inclusion and diversity and seeing that as a real business opportunity.
So let's fast forward a few years' time. What does success look like for these companies if they were to follow your playbook? And I'm not saying that inequality is going to be eliminated just by reading your book, of course, but what does success look like?
I think success looks like much better representation at leadership levels. So we did some research at Equality Group earlier this year, looking at the change in the Ftse 100 CEO leadership. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that much change over the last 3 years. We still have more Steves and Andys than women or ethnic minorities combined. And 3 years ago, it used to be Dave and Andy. So there's a long way to go. And in 10 years' time, I'd like to see some Ibrahims or Sophias, just more representation at top leadership levels, because we need those role models and we also need that diversity of thought coming through. So that will be my hope.
And do we need some kind of economic shift in terms of changes in ownership structures and changes when it comes to equity?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, because it's not only like who's in the position of power, but who ultimately holds the economic wealth, which is about equity ownership in businesses. And we did some work last year on the Future Fund, where the government was giving out huge grants to tech startups. And they were reporting on the makeup of the management teams around the diversity, socioeconomic, racial, gender, which was all well and good. But actually, what we really want to know is who owns the equity, who actually owns these companies and will benefit from the outsized returns that they produce in the future. And that wasn't reported on. And I think that's a really important part, like fundamentally, who not only has the power, but who has the wealth. And can we get that more representatively distributed?
Mm. So, but obviously that kind of change takes a long time.
It does. This is not a quick fix, and it's not a short journey, but I think it's well worth doing.
Okay. Okay. Now I want to open up the floor really to people if they've got specific questions they want to throw in and ask Ftse, because I know we've got some more time, and also Ftse's got a range of anecdotes which we can talk about as well. But please do chip in and message us to let us know what you think. Ftse, asked you a bit earlier on about any personal stories when you've gone into meetings and you've asked people and they've been resistant to changes. Can you think of anything in that kind of space?
Yeah, we've had a couple of examples around people not being aware of microaggressions that can happen. So an example that we've heard of a couple of times when we've conducted sort of anonymous interviews ahead of training sessions we've run is around people being mistaken for the entry guard at an office building, and they've immediately gone to a black colleague and said, "Can you let me in? Can you let me into this entry gate?" And they're not. They're literally just on the 6th floor as well in the investment team. And that's been very surprising when we presented that back at a couple of organizations. People have generally said that doesn't happen here, that we would never do that. It's like, no, this is from your company, this is in your office building, this does happen. And that can be very eye-opening for people because they've never experienced it. They don't know that that's happening, and it can be happening, multiple times a year for certain people, or being mistaken, for the person, a secretary, when actually you're not, you're like the head of the legal department. So there's lots of different examples like that where there are assumptions made about individuals that aren't correct, and that they feel are, and quite rightly, are not respecting the position that they do actually have within a company.
It's interesting because sometimes people, I think, park ideas of diversity and inclusion just within HR. But what you're saying in this book is that it's actually more important than that culturally.
Yes, it's a lot more important than that. I mean, it links in very much to the business culture and the fundamentals of what the business is producing and the value that it has, which is why I talk about those innovation examples, like the benefits of it, and the many research studies that have shown that diverse teams produce better business results.
Great. Got a question here from Pam. She says, many firms are recruiting diverse talent at junior level, but how do you move from tokenism to inclusion? Ftse, have you got any tips on what leaders can do to ensure these new and diverse voices are heard?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you do have a lot of pyramiding happening in organizations, which means that you have a lot of diversity at the bottom of the pyramid, and then it fades away to the top. And the leaky pipeline is a very, very real issue in a lot of industries, especially in finance, where you just can't retain that diverse talent that you've spent a lot of effort and a lot of money trying to bring in. And that comes down to more the culture and also those people processes that I was talking about. So a lot of the time, and especially in the finance industry, it's very opaque as to how you actually are going to get rewarded and promoted. And quite a lot of time, it's who you know and not necessarily what you know. And even what you know might not be sufficient. So there needs to be a lot more transparency and a lot more structure given to those review and retention processes to keep maintaining that diverse talent, helping them really flourish and thrive and get promoted all the way to the top. So it's both, it's an organizational level responsibility, rather than sort of individuals always having to go that extra mile. I think organizations need to take the responsibility to do the redesign and the rethinking about what their organization, how their organization runs, and who it represents and who it really nurtures.
Is there something to be said about the idea of people who've been recruited from diverse communities potentially having a sponsor or a role model specifically to guide them through their careers?
Yes, and mentorship and sponsorship have been shown to be very, very impactful in helping with retention and progression. And also the concept of reverse mentoring, so having either more junior colleagues mentor more senior colleagues, or minority background colleagues mentor the majority. So reversing the role of mentor and mentee, because it creates very different conversations and a lot of learning and insights. And it can really accelerate management's understanding of what is needed for those minority or those junior groups in an organization.
Great. I've got a few more questions coming in. Okay, so here we go. What would be your advice for a young entrepreneur looking to be an advocate and to make an impact? That's from Mina.
Great. Hi, Mina. Mina was the book competition winner. So I posted it to you in Helsinki yesterday, Mina, so you should be getting it. Well, I think thinking about the teams, first of all, that you're building and who is in your teams, both from your immediate team, but also thinking about your advisory board, which different perspectives and different backgrounds are you getting into that mix. It will probably be, just like I find it, all too easy to find people that are similar to you, and you want to go beyond that, and you want to get their input into the business that you're building, and you want to get as many viewpoints. That wisdom of the crowd has been shown to be very, very powerful. So that's what they're going to bring you. They're going to bring you a lot of wisdom through that diversity.
Okay, that's great. So I've got another question here for you as well, from Alan. He says, Ftse, have you got any solid evidence or anecdotes to prove the success of reverse mentoring?
Yeah, well, quite a few of the big four firms have written about it, actually. EY and KPMG have both written extensively about the impact that reverse mentoring has made on the organization, especially around ethnic diversity. So I can happily share further sort of case study examples of that. And we've also known from a couple of our clients as well that they've started to use that and seen that as a really powerful way of opening up people's perspectives and this lens on inclusion and diversity. Check out EY. I think they've published it on their website.
And is there like a trade-off though in terms of the level of resource you've got to put into that? Because obviously if you're having lots of schemes like this, there's a cost, there's time involved too, but is there definitely a benefit which businesses can see statistically?
Yeah, I think you can definitely see the benefits. I also forgot to mention the Dobbin and Karlev research. They're two professors from Harvard, and they studied over 800 companies and different initiatives that they had, and they showed outsized returns for the progress made on diversity and inclusion through structured mentoring programs. So that wasn't on reverse mentoring, that was just structured mentoring, because they showed that both any minority groups, and they were looking at women where they were in the minority, and ethnic minorities needed a very clear structured program, which, as you say, Warren, does take time and does take effort, but there were outsized returns on that from the level of recruitment and retention of those groups and the endorsement that they were getting for what they were doing on their diversity and inclusion strategy.
Right.
So that's worth looking at as well, and I mentioned that a couple of times in the book.
Okay, question here from Nimisha. Often we hear that diversity helps improve company performance, but is this really the right way of thinking about it? Would you like some thoughts on this? Yeah.
I understand that. I hear that argument around, but this is just the right thing to do. This is the good thing. We're all people. We should all be equal. We should all be equally valued. And why do people need an economic and a business argument just to do the right thing? I totally agree with you, but it turns out there's a lot of people that do need the economic and the business case argument to to be able to see that this really is the right thing, to see that this is actually like has hard data behind it, has evidence behind it. And to be honest, I don't mind if I have to convince people of the business case to get them to do the socially right thing. And it's wonderful. And I do, and we do at Equality Group, meet a lot of fantastic people in business that get both the social moral case and the business case. But I just want everyone to be doing this. So I'll tackle it from whatever perspective works.
I guess what's also interesting, so it's a great follow-up question from Alan here. He says, how can you reach homogenous teams that don't see the lack of diversity as an issue?
I mean, I have to say money talks. And what I see in our industries where we work is when shareholders, equity owners, and investors are saying, you need to be doing this. Why does your entire team look like one type of person? Have you thought about this and what are you doing? And that really makes homogenous teams pay attention, because a lack of diversity in groupthink isn't good for anyone, whatever type of team.
So homogenous groups are never a good thing.
No, homogenous groups are never going to be as effective as diverse groups. Groupthink is very, very dangerous. Groupthink has led us into quite a lot of economic catastrophes and mistakes.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it's a case of hammering that home, that homogenous groups are one step away from a disaster? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's one way of doing it. And I should have given that one of chapter titles that, Warren, actually.
Next time.
Next time.
Right, here's one for you, new one. Okay. There's a federal government agency in Australia that requires all companies with 100 plus employees to report against key gender equality criteria. Is that a good thing? I think is what they're saying in this question from Tanya.
Right, I'm just seeing, sorry, Tanya's post, because I haven't looked at this Australian government policy. So they get all companies with 100 plus employees to report against key gender equity. Oh, I see, alongside it, along these lines. Yes, I think reporting on diversity data is very powerful and very important. So yes, and I think the UK does have the same for the public sector, indeed. And for the private sector, they obviously brought in the gender pay gap reporting, and earlier we were talking about that there would be real benefits in bringing in race pay gap reporting as well. So yes, I think transparency and visibility is really beneficial. And that's where government can play a really important part. But companies can just do this themselves. And there are some very good companies that are starting to do that. You know, that they see it coming down the track and they might as well be ahead of the curve and know their data, report on it, be held to account and see progress.
Why do you think there's a reluctance by the current government to report on or legislate for race data or in terms of salaries being enforced?
I mean, why did they put the gender pay gap reporting on pause last year as the only piece of company reporting that was put on hold during COVID? I don't know, Warren. I'd love to know that. It doesn't actually make very much sense to me.
So you think it's a sense that it's really important that that's lobbied for, because that could lead to potential benefits, not just for workers but also for companies, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think government's sort of supportive, endorsing role is essential, and it's a deep shame when they don't fulfill that role.
Yeah. Alan's kind of followed up by asking about do governments hold organisations to the correct level of accountability in EDI?
I mean, some governments definitely don't. I would say in the UK we could be doing a bit more. At the same time, I think this is the amazing thing about business, is you have such a huge opportunity and huge levels of freedom to innovate and to do things faster than governments can do. Not only faster, but also longer term. I mean, governments get voted in and out, 4 years, even shorter recently. And whereas you as a business leader can be building your organization over multiple decades. I mean, look at an organization like the John Lewis Partnership. And the work that they've been doing around sustainability and diversity, that's had its roots in many years of history, and they can continue that. And they've got a very good sort of equity employee ownership model as well. So I think there's an opportunity for business leaders to be able to do more than governments, because they can do it on a more sustained basis for longer periods of time, and they can be more innovative.
Yeah. And Pam sent in the question in saying, how do we encourage governments to promote the fact that ethnicity data can be gathered voluntarily, used by many management teams across as an excuse for doing nothing? Personally, I think that engaging in discussion with employees helps.
Yes, I think equipping employees with that knowledge, going through employee resource groups and networks, and making that more common knowledge would be good. And it, it can be lobbied for, as you were saying, like grassroots employee based initiatives can be very powerful. So I think employees coming together and say, we want to see this data, we want to know where our organisation stands. We're starting to see that happening. That's been one of the initiatives that's been taken in the wake of the last year and the awareness around racial equality.
Yeah, Jeremy's asked something about intersectionality. He said he's very conscious of the hostility many trans people are facing from the government and in society. Can a more diverse workforce be allies to groups under pressure?
Is that Jeremy Pemberton?
Yes.
Dad, have you just dragged me into the trans debate?
Yes, darling.
This is a very, very difficult area. And actually,
don't commit too much.
I'm sure you could probably answer it better than me. So for anyone that doesn't know, this is my darling dad, who's been a lifelong supporter and has just asked me a very difficult question, which I'm going to actually slightly skirt, Dad, and say that we do look at the LGBT plus lens in some detail in the book, but not as much as, say, gender and race. And part of the reason for that is because there isn't as much research out there, and because I'm basing the recommendations in this book on academic research and business case studies, it is lighter on this area. And I still think there's so much to work out with the trans agenda that I think businesses are really going much near it, to be honest. And I think that has to be worked out, first of all, in society, and a clear view on like what is the right thing to do, and then somehow that needs to be translated into what should businesses be doing, and what are the business benefits of doing this well. So I would not be the expert on that. Yeah.
I think it's sometimes fine to say you don't know the answer, isn't it?
I don't. And I'd very, very happily take a lead from other people on this, and would be interested to see how that develops. But I think certainly what we see from the LGBT plus lens work that we do is that thinking about aspects of invisible diversity, which obviously sexuality is, even if people assume they can tell people's sexuality from the way they look, they can't, is really, really valuable as we think about what are the things that influence invisible diversity and inclusion. How comfortable do people feel at work being who they are, not only who people can see they are, but who people can't necessarily see that they are. And so I think measures of how a percentage of people that are out at work and are comfortable being out are one of the very, very good measures of inclusion for an organization, which I only sometimes see being done, but I think is one of the ones you can use alongside other metrics like a sense of belonging or quality of feedback or team collaboration. Those are the ones which are good for thinking about inclusion.
Okay, fantastic. Conscious it's 1:45, and I think we had 45 minutes and a bit more time. But Ftse, is there anything you want to say to kind of wrap up and regarding the book?
Well, I would absolutely love, I'm sure many people on this call, and I can see many people on this call have already purchased a book, but I would love it if you could share it on your socials. It's available on Amazon, and the Kindle version is only 99p for today, to get it out as broadly as possible. So please do share that with your networks, and also please do leave a review when you've had a chance to read it. I would love to have a review, and would love to keep actually discussing the topic with people. So please message me on LinkedIn and stay in touch, and where you think that this message is useful to your organization or to people that you know, then I'd love to be in touch.
Fantastic. Ftse, thank you very much. It's been really good chatting. Thank you all so much for your questions. It's been really great to hear them as well. So Ftse's book, The Diversity Playbook, is out now. Get it from all the usual places and start talking about it and sharing about it. Thank you very much.
So much, Warren. And thank you everyone for dialing in today. It's great to see you. And thank you for all of your support.